Have you ever wondered if the hero everyone admires is really what he seems to be? And if, behind the flawless uniform, there was someone carrying guilt, fear, and silent loneliness? Homelander is living proof that perfection can be a prison, and that heroism often hides deep wounds. In this video, we will dive into the mind of a man who dominates the world on the outside but fights to survive on the inside. Get ready to uncover secrets, dilemmas, and traumas that no one dares to show, and understand how true humanity hides behind the myth. If you are a fan of cinema and psychology and want to understand the mind behind your favorite character, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any videos. But first, comment below which character you want me to analyze here on the channel. Now, let's get into the video. At first glance, Homelander seems like the embodiment of the perfect hero, flawless, strong, and with a charisma that inspires crowds. But if we look closer, we realize that this perfection is carefully constructed, like a shining mask over a dark complexity. He wasn't born this way, and his story reveals that every heroic gesture carries layers that few notice. Think of that coworker who always smiles at work but faces silent storms inside. It is exactly this duality that makes his journey so intriguing. From an early age, Homelander was shaped to be a symbol rather than a person. The pressure to meet society's expectations and to be the ideal savior molded his character in subtle and profound ways. He grew up understanding that vulnerability was not allowed. Weakness meant failure, and failing publicly would be unforgivable. This is something many people feel, that invisible weight of always having to be perfect, even when no one sees what happens behind the scenes. Behind the cape and the immaculate uniform, there is a strict upbringing and imposed values, almost like a script he was meant to follow precisely. Discipline and emotional control were the foundation of his upbringing, and that ended up reinforcing a persona that absorbs all pain but never shows it. We can think of it as a child learning to swallow tears to avoid disappointing their parents, but on an epic scale, with the whole world watching. And this construction is not only external, he internalized the idea of heroism as something that requires extreme sacrifice, often of himself. Every choice, every action carries the expectation of being flawless, of never hesitating, of being immaculate. Imagine someone who feels they cannot make mistakes, not even in the smallest details of life, because that could be seen as a moral or professional failure. That shapes the mind in an almost obsessive way, creating a hero who is, paradoxically, a prisoner of his own image. A curious detail is that he managed to turn that pressure into power, using public perception to his advantage. He learned early that charisma and presence can manipulate narratives, and that makes him extremely strategic. He's the kind of person who notices nuances in others before they even notice them themselves. Think of that coworker who always knows what to say to impress a crowd or win a tough situation, but on a much larger scale, because his stage is the entire world. Despite all this construction, there are still fragments of hidden humanity, moments that slip through the mask and show a being who feels, who questions, but rarely allows others to see. He keeps secrets and emotions like precious relics, revealing them only when absolutely necessary. This dynamic creates a fascinating contrast, something everyone feels at some level, that internal battle between what we show and what we truly feel. Another layer of his story involves the constant need for external validation. He needs to be loved, admired, and respected, and he often confuses public acceptance with personal acceptance. It is a trap that creates constant tension because Homelander defines himself through others' eyes. It reminds us that everyone, to some degree, seeks approval, but few face a pressure of such magnitude as his, where every failure is amplified and every success is meticulously observed. Finally, understanding his story means realizing that Homelander is a combination of myth and vulnerability, a carefully woven narrative that both captivates and frightens. He is the reflection of what happens when the world demands perfection, and humanity struggles to survive behind the mask. Every detail of his path prepares us to understand the internal conflicts he faces, because, in truth, all his grandeur comes with heavy shadows. And it is exactly those shadows that lead us to the next chapter of his story. Behind the shining uniform and confident smile, Homelander carries wounds that almost no one notices. One of them is the constant battle with guilt, the feeling that any failure, even the smallest one, could be catastrophic. Imagine carrying the weight of the expectations of millions of people on your back and still blaming yourself when something doesn't go perfectly. This silent guilt seeps into his decisions, shaping his behavior in ways almost imperceptible yet powerful. A deep trauma is tied to his upbringing. The strict discipline and imposed values from an early age left marks that even he cannot fully measure. He learned to swallow emotions, suffocate feelings, and ignore vulnerabilities because weakness was synonymous with failure. It is like trying to breathe underwater your whole life. You learn to survive, but the psychological cost is high and the pressure builds with every held breath. Another latent conflict is the obsessive need for control. Homelander feels that if he doesn't dominate every situation, something terrible might happen. This manifests in authoritarian behavior, calculated decisions, and a huge difficulty in trusting others. It's like that friend who plans every detail of a trip because they're afraid something might go wrong. But here, the scale is global, and the stakes are life or death for him and everyone around him. He also faces a constant battle with his moral identity. On the outside, he is the symbol of justice and virtue. Inside, he questions every action, every lie he must sustain to maintain his public image. It's the kind of dilemma anyone feels when they need to lie to please or protect themselves. Except for him, the lie becomes institutionalized, a mask that cannot fall under the risk of total collapse. The pressure for perfection also generates chronic anxiety and fear of failure. Every decision is weighed, every step carefully calculated because one mistake could have irreversible consequences. It's like walking a tightrope, but with the feeling that a fall isn't just physical, it's moral, social, emotional. And this constant anxiety shapes his personality, making him meticulous, ruthless with himself, and paradoxically charming to the world. Another subtle trauma is emotional loneliness. No matter how many people surround him, he rarely allows deep connections, afraid of showing weakness or being rejected. It's the classic trap of the lonely hero. Everyone sees the strength, but no one feels the pain. This isolation reinforces defensive behavior and creates a cycle of disconnection where his only real company is the image he projects to the world. There's also the conflict with authenticity. Every public gesture is calculated, every word carefully chosen to maintain his perfect hero reputation. This creates constant inner exhaustion because he never truly lives outside the persona he created. Think of that person who always seems happy on social media but feels an empty silence once they close their door. Accept that for him. The consequences are much more intense and complex. All these traumas intertwine, creating a hero who is, at his core, a prisoner of himself. Guilt, the need for control, loneliness, and the pursuit of perfection shape his decisions, his relationships, and even his worldview. And it is exactly this complexity that prepares us to understand how he acts in the face of challenges, because every internal conflict directly influences his choices and leads us to the next chapter of the analysis. The crushing guilt and how it shapes his decisions. Guilt is perhaps the most persistent ghost in Homelander's mind. Every choice he makes carries an invisible weight, as if he were constantly walking on broken glass. It's that feeling everyone has had of wishing they had done something differently to avoid disaster, but multiplied by millions of eyes watching every mistake. This silent guilt guides many of his actions, shaping not only his strategies but his own morality. Since youth, he learned that failure was not an option and that every slip could come at a high cost. Society, and even his own internal values, reinforce that being a hero means taking on responsibilities that often go beyond human comprehension. It's like taking the blame for something not entirely under your control and still feeling you failed if something goes wrong. This pressure turns guilt into an internal weapon, but also into an invisible prison. Guilt manifests almost ritualistically. He evaluates every move, anticipates problems, and blames himself for every outcome. Imagine someone who, even in trivial daily situations, replays every decision to avoid regret. But here, the stakes are human lives. This obsessive behavior generates both precision and extreme tension because the line between protection and paranoia is thin. A classic example is how he reacts to threats or allies' mistakes. He often makes ruthless decisions, believing it is his duty to correct any failure. It's the kind of mindset that turns small slips into epic dramas, where every action must be calculated to avoid the moral catastrophe that guilt suggests. We can relate this to leaders or managers who feel everything depends on them, turning every mistake into something personal and painful. This trauma also affects his emotional life and relationships. He distances himself, avoids vulnerability, and maintains an immaculate facade because he feels that showing weakness would be admitting guilt. It's like someone who never asks for help, even when they need it, to avoid feeling responsible for disappointing others. Guilt, in that sense, is both a burden and an armor, protecting and isolating at the same time. The intensity of this feeling creates moments of inner conflict, where he constantly questions the morality of his actions. Every decision is heavy, every gesture analyzed, because he fears failing himself before failing the world. It's similar to that fear everyone feels when making important life choices, only amplified on a global scale and with far more dramatic consequences. This trauma also explains why he is so strategic and meticulous. Every step, every word, every gesture is planned to minimize future guilt. He learned that prevention is better than cure, but this constant vigilance consumes emotional energy and creates tension that is almost tangible. It's like living in a constant pre-crisis where the mind never rests and every choice becomes a silent battle. In the end, guilt shapes almost everything he does, his decisions, his posture, his relationships, and even his sense of justice. It's a weight that defines yet limits him, creating a hero who seems invincible but is, in truth, imprisoned by his own sense of responsibility. And it is exactly this imprisonment that leads us to the next conflict, the obsessive need for control that arises as a direct consequence of this crushing guilt. The obsessive need for control and its impact on relationships and decisions. The need for control is one of the most silent and powerful forces that shape. He feels that if something slips out of his hands, everything could fall apart. It's like that friend who needs to organize every detail of a trip, but here the scale is global, and every wrong step could cost lives. This obsession creates efficiency and strategy, but also limits connections and generates constant tension because nothing can be left to chance. Since childhood, he learned that trusting others was risky. Every mistake made by someone else seemed to reflect directly on him, so he began taking on responsibilities that weren't his. Imagine someone who feels that if others fail, they'll carry the weight of it all alone. This pressure turns into an almost compulsive need to control every situation. Control manifests not only in strategic decisions, but also in his personal life. He monitors behavior, anticipates movements, and often manipulates situations to minimize risks. He's like a chess player, always thinking 5 moves ahead, but with the difference that each piece on the board represents real and vulnerable people. This trauma also affects his ability to trust emotionally. He avoids vulnerability, keeps distance from those close to him, and rarely shares insecurities. It's that feeling of having to carry the world alone even when support is available, and that creates emotional isolation. The consequence, relationships become superficial, and inner tension turns every genuine connection into something difficult to sustain. Extreme control also creates moral rigidity. He believes only he knows what is right, and any deviation from his rules is intolerable. This explains authoritarian attitudes and ruthless decisions because he feels there is no room for error. It's like a film director who never allows improvisation because he believes only he sees the perfect narrative, even if it causes conflict behind the scenes. The need for control is directly linked to the guilt he carries if something goes wrong. The guilt is his. So keeping everything under his control is a self-protection strategy, even if it costs him relationships or his own peace of mind. Think of it like trying to hold sand in your hands. The tighter you grip, the more it slips away, yet you keep trying, trapped in the illusion that you can control everything. This trauma also creates dramatic tension in his decisions as a hero. Every action is weighted, every choice calculated because he fears losing control of the situation. This obsession creates a complex character, strategic, efficient, and admired, but emotionally trapped and isolated. The line between leadership and obsession is thin, and he walks it every single day, often without realizing it. In the end, the need for control turns his life into a game of constant precision. He learns to anticipate risks, plan moves, and manipulate outcomes, but he pays a high emotional price: isolation, disconnection, and constant tension. And it is precisely this tension that leads us to explore another dark aspect of his psychology: the conflict between public identity and personal authenticity. conflict between public identity and personal authenticity. Homelander lives in a constant duality on the outside. He is the symbol of heroism and perfection. On the inside, there are doubts, fears, and repressed desires. He is like that coworker who always seems confident and happy on social media but hides deep insecurities. This dichotomy creates tension because he feels he must maintain the image of the perfect hero at all costs, even if it costs him his own truth. From an early age, he learned that vulnerability is weakness. Showing genuine emotions could destabilize public perception and, consequently, his authority as a hero. It is like performing on a stage where the audience expects perfection. Any gesture off script is judged and amplified. This constant pressure shapes his personality, making him calculating and strategic even in his closest relationships. Public identity often directly conflicts with his inner values. He knows what would be right or humane, but what society expects does not always align with that. Imagine having to smile and shake hands while your instincts scream to be honest, critical, or even distant. This inner tension creates silent frustration but also develops impressive manipulation and social perception skills. A clear example is how he deals with allies and subordinates. Outwardly, he projects confidence and absolute leadership. Inside, he calculates, analyzes, and sometimes manipulates to maintain control and protect his image. He is like a CEO who must appear in total command, even while facing ethical dilemmas or internal crises. This facade works to maintain power and influence but comes at a steep emotional cost. This conflict also manifests in his personal relationships. He avoids real intimacy because he fears that exposing his weaknesses could shatter the image the world expects. It is like building a glass castle. Everything must look flawless, but each internal crack increases the risk of collapse. This emotional isolation is a defense mechanism but also reinforces the loneliness that permeates his life. The struggle between authenticity and public identity creates morally complex decisions. He constantly has to choose between acting with integrity or maintaining his heroic perception, and each choice leaves deep marks on his conscience. It is like standing before a distorted mirror, where reflecting who he truly is could bring devastating consequences. This constant tension shapes his personality, making him intense, calculating, and, in a way, fascinating. The public only sees the shine of perfection, but those who look closely perceive the inner risks and the ongoing effort to sustain the mask. It is the classic battle between image and essence that many of us, on a smaller scale, also face in our lives. In the end, understanding this duality prepares us to comprehend another crucial aspect of Homelander's psychology: emotional loneliness, and how it amplifies other traumas, making his relationships and choices even more complex and difficult to decipher. Emotional loneliness and the isolation that shapes his relationships. Emotional loneliness is one of Homelander's most silent traumas. No matter how surrounded he is by people and allies, he rarely allows anyone to see his vulnerabilities. It is like being in a crowded room yet feeling completely alone because no one knows the real self behind the mask. This isolation shapes his decisions and strengthens his facade, but at the same time, it imprisons him. From early on, he learned that showing vulnerability could be fatal. Every gesture of weakness was interpreted as incompetence or moral failure, and that taught him to hide emotions at all costs. He is like someone who always smiles at parties but silently faces inner storms no one notices. This ability to hide feelings is a protection but also a barrier that separates him from the world. Emotional loneliness also directly influences his relationships. He keeps his distance, avoids true intimacy, and creates an invisible wall between himself and others. Imagine having to keep everyone at arm's length, even when craving connection, just to avoid being vulnerable. This creates constant tension. He wants closeness but fears losing control or being emotionally hurt. This isolation makes his perception of loyalty and trust extremely rigid. He judges others' actions with severe strictness because he fears disappointment or betrayal. It is like walking on thin ice. One wrong step can lead to a painful fall, and he prefers to control every move rather than risk opening up. This trauma creates a mix of distrust and need for dominance. Another effect of emotional loneliness is the difficulty in expressing genuine emotions publicly. On the outside, he is flawless, confident, and inspiring. Inside, there is frustration, fear, and longing for connection. This duality reinforces his image as a hero, but intensifies the inner burden. It is like carrying a party balloon full of perfection while his heart feels empty and suffocated. Emotional loneliness intertwines with other traumas, such as guilt and obsession with control. Every perceived failure reinforces isolation. Every potential mistake increases the need to dominate situations. It is a continuous cycle where the hero strengthens himself to protect the world but pays a high price of disconnection from himself and others. This emotional barrier also explains why he is so meticulous in every interaction. Every word, gesture, and decision is filtered because opening up would mean risking internal wounds. He is like a mirror. He reflects only what he wants others to see, hiding the storm within. And it is this storm that leads us to the next trauma, directly tied to morality and the ethical dilemmas he faces. Finally, emotional loneliness helps us understand how Homelander connects or disconnects from the world. It reinforces other traumas and shapes his personality, creating a hero who is admired, feared, and at the same time profoundly human. And this understanding prepares us to dive into the next topic, the ethical and moral conflict that defines his most difficult choices. Ethical and moral conflict that defines his choices. Homelander faces a constant battle between what is morally right and what is necessary to maintain his image and control of the world. It is like the dilemma we all face, to be honest or to do what works. But for him, the stage is global, and every decision impacts millions of lives, making each choice an intense moral tension. From early on, he learned that the greater good does not always align with absolute rules or principles. Sometimes, to protect, he needs to act questionably, manipulate situations, or hide truths. He is like a doctor who must decide between two treatments, each with severe risks. He feels the weight of every decision, even if he appears calm to others. This moral conflict produces dramatic and often unpopular decisions. He feels that justice must be served, but public perception and the need for control often clash with what would be ethical. Imagine having to choose between saving someone the right way or saving the world while maintaining the image of a perfect hero. Each decision leaves deep invisible scars. An example is how he deals with enemies and allies. The line between protection and manipulation is thin, and every move is calculated. He must weigh immediate and future consequences, always balancing image, power, and morality. It is like playing chess with living pieces where each movement is measured with near-obsessive precision. The ethical conflict also reinforces his emotional isolation. He does not share his hardest decisions because he fears judgment or misunderstanding. It is like carrying heavy secrets alone, unable to trust anyone. This burden shapes his behavior, reinforcing the strategic and calculating demeanor we see on the surface. This constant moral battle influences his relationships and sense of trust. He judges intentions and actions harshly because he fears failure or betrayal. It is like walking a tight emotional rope where every misstep could mean personal and public disaster. This trauma connects directly to his need for control and guilt. The ethical conflict also explains why he is both admired and feared. He acts decisively, often ruthlessly, but always with purpose. The perception of justice and integrity he projects depends on his ability to balance morality, strategy, and public image. It is the paradox of a hero who must be cruel to be seen as righteous. Finally, understanding this moral dilemma leads us directly to the next topic. Combined to shape his personality, his choices, and his complex worldview. Every action he takes is the consequence of an intense and multifaceted psychological mosaic. How all his traumas and inner conflicts shape his personality and choices. When we bring together all of Homelander's traumas, we realize they intertwine, forming a complex psychological mosaic. Guilt, need for control, emotional loneliness, and moral dilemmas are not isolated. Each amplifies the other. It is like a river with multiple tributaries. Each stream has its own force, but together they shape the flow's direction and intensity. These inner conflicts define his public posture. He is confident, admired, and powerful, but that flawless image is the result of years of emotional discipline and obsessive control. He is like an actor mastering every expression, every gesture, delivering a perfect performance even when feeling intense turmoil inside. His need for perfection and control shapes strategic, often ruthless choices. Every decision is calculated to minimize failure, guilt, and risk, making him efficient and feared. Imagine someone planning every step as if moving gigantic chess pieces, where one wrong move could cost lives or reputations. Emotional loneliness strengthens his independence but makes true relationships difficult. He learns to trust himself above all else, creating barriers that protect yet isolate. He is like a lone ship captain at sea, maintaining control of the helm while the shore of human connection remains distant. Constant guilt and moral conflict shape his sense of responsibility and morality. He acts as an invisible judge over himself and others, weighing every consequence. It is like living in a permanent internal courtroom where every decision, no matter how simple, must be justified. These traumas make Homelander a paradoxical figure, powerful and admirable, yet emotionally restrained, strategic and efficient, yet morally complex, inspiring, yet lonely. It is this combination that creates both fascination and fear, because no one knows exactly where the hero ends and the man begins. Every behavior, gesture, and choice he makes is a direct consequence of these interconnected traumas. The public image, the need for control, and emotional isolation are layers that together explain his seemingly extreme or unpopular decisions. It is like deciphering a psychological code that blends survival, power, and humanity. Finally, understanding how these conflicts shape his personality prepares us to see Homelander beyond the surface, not just as a symbol of heroism, but as a complex human being, a prisoner of his own shadows and ambitions. And this understanding paves the way for the engaging introduction of the video, which will emotionally connect the viewer to the story. So, what did you think about diving into Homelander's mind? Were you able to see the man behind the hero and understand how guilt, control, and loneliness shape his every choice? Now I want to know, which character would you like me to analyze in the next video? Leave your comment and share your opinion, because your participation helps create even deeper content. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to keep following all the psychological analyses and uncover the darkest secrets of the characters you love.